In this video, we will use Altair Panopticon to visualize an endpoint deployment on Altair AI Hub. For demonstration purposes, we will use an AI Studio workflow generating 5 minutes of data for 3 virtual sensors. This workflow will return updated data each time we run it. Let's start with creating a new deployment, exposing the workflow as an endpoint. We can restrict the access by requiring an API token. Make sure to copy the newly generated token for later use in Panopticon. Next, we need to add the workflow to the deployment. The workflow only uses a single macro, which we will cover in a separate video. It also does not have any dependencies. Thus, we can keep the default configuration. Click Save and Deploy to complete the setup. Once deployed, we can test the endpoint with an empty input dataset. Make sure to also provide the generated API token. The endpoint should return 3 data points per second, 1 for each of the 3 time series. Before we move on to Panopticon, make sure to copy the endpoint URL. Over in Panopticon, we first need to add a new data table, for example in our personal workspace in the data library. We need to use the RapidMiner AI Hub connector from the file and URL group. In the connector settings, enter the endpoint URL into the respective text field. Select API token as authentication type and enter the token. We can now click on Generate Columns, and Panopticon will automatically pick up the correct column names and types. We can also refresh the preview of the data table at the bottom of the page. Finally, let's change the auto-refresh setting in the data table settings. By default, Panopticon will update the data every 15 minutes. We can lower this to 5 seconds to obtain a live view of our data. Before we continue with visualizing the data, make sure to save the data table. We can now use the deployment endpoint data in any Panopticon dashboard. To try this, let's create a new workbook. First, we need to add our data table from the data library to our workbook. Next, we need to set up the dashboard layout. We can use the template named Single Plus Filter and use its main part for an x-axis graph. Drag the time column onto the x-axis and the 3 time series onto the y-axis pill. While we continue to tweak the settings of the x-axis graph, we can already see that Panopticon is updating the data every 5 seconds. Behind the scenes, each update will call the deployment endpoint we have configured earlier. And each time the endpoint is invoked, we run the deployed AI Studio workflow. Finally, let's replace the filter with a series legend control. Linking the control to our x-axis graph allows for selecting and deselecting individual series. We can now save and view the dashboard to see this in action. The dashboard allows us to select any combination of series, all while Panopticon keeps updating the data automatically.